In just a few short years, have you ever wondered how a remote and thinly populated area developed into a thriving colony that shapes modern Australia? Australia experienced political upheavals, economic booms, and cultural growth between 1830 and 1860 that prepared the ground for the country we know today. Which forces drove this quick change? How did they affect the land itself, Indigenous people, and the colonists? Come explore with us this interesting age when the seeds of modern Australia were sown. Australia in the 1830s. First, let us return to the early 1830s. Only barely reaching 50,000, most of the European population in Australia was dispersed along the coastlines. The continent was vast, mostly unexplored and unforgiving, making life for the settlers anything but easy. Convicts and free settlers alike struggled to survive in a harsh environment. The journey from the early 1830s to the 1860s, however, saw a dramatic change. 4 of the 6 states of today were founded, and the population exploded to over 1 million persons. But numbers alone don't tell the full story. Australia's identity as a nation began to form during this time. Ambition, resistance, opportunity, and survival shaped this transformation, marking key turning points in settlement, politics, the economy, and culture. The growth of settlements, challenges, and opportunities. Let's begin with the settlements themselves. In the 1830s, new colonies were still being established, notably Western Australia in 1829. Western Australia's story is one of incredible resilience. James Stirling, a British naval captain, convinced the British government to establish a colony in the Swan River region, believing it had potential. But the land turned out to be harsher than expected, and the settlers, including wealthy adventurers like Thomas Peel, faced tremendous difficulties. With little governmental support and the arid climate working against them, the settlers struggled to establish agriculture and a stable economy. Western Australia's early decades were fraught with challenges, yet the colony persisted, eventually finding its place within the broader tapestry of Australian history. Contrast this with South Australia, established in 1836, which had a very different approach to settlement. Edward Gibbon Wakefield, a British social reformer, had a vision of creating a colony based on equality and economic self-sufficiency. His idea was to sell land at a price high enough to encourage productive use, ensuring that settlers would cultivate the land efficiently rather than holding it for speculation. This model attracted a mix of settlers, including families and skilled workers, fostering a more structured and balanced society. Adelaide, the capital, became a center of trade and cultural development, and by the 1840s, South Australia was flourishing. In the Port Phillip district, modern-day Victoria, another settlement was booming. Melbourne was founded in 1835, and the rapid influx of settlers transformed the area into a thriving hub of commerce. The district's population grew so quickly that by 1851, it separated from New South Wales to become its own colony, Victoria. This period of intense settlement saw vast swaths of land brought under European control, often leading to violent conflicts with the Indigenous peoples who had lived there for thousands of years. Finally, Queensland was the last major colony to form during this period. It officially became a separate colony from New South Wales in 1859. Settlement patterns in Queensland mirrored the struggles of the other colonies, as settlers ventured further inland, establishing farms and towns in previously uncharted territories. But let's not forget the cost of this expansion. Indigenous Australians bore the brunt of these transformations. As settlers claimed more land, Indigenous communities were displaced, and many were subjected to violence and disease. The frontier conflicts between settlers and Indigenous groups are often underrepresented in the historical narrative, but they are a crucial part of understanding the complex dynamics of colonization during this time. The push for political reforms and self-government politically, the colonies were undergoing dramatic shifts during this era as well. By the early 1840s, the push for self-government was gaining momentum. The settlers, particularly the wealthier landowners, wanted more control over their own affairs, rather than being ruled from distant Britain. In 1842, New South Wales gained a partially elected legislature, marking a significant shift in governance. This was a step toward greater autonomy, though the imperial government in London still maintained considerable control. By 1850, other colonies followed suit. The Australian Colonies Government Act, passed by the British Parliament, laid the groundwork for more democratic governance. By 1856, most of Australia's colonies had gained responsible self-government, allowing them to manage their own internal affairs. However, this process wasn't without resistance. Some colonists were frustrated by the continuing presence of convicts and the costs associated with maintaining penal settlements. Others resented British control over land distribution and policy, which often favored the wealthy elite over small settlers. A particularly notable political uprising during this period was the Eureka Stockade of 1854. The Victorian gold rushes brought immense wealth, but also social tension. The miners, known as diggers, resented the taxes imposed by the colonial authorities, especially the hefty license fees required to dig for gold. At Ballarat and Victoria, tensions boiled over, leading to the formation of the Eureka Stockade, a barricade built by diggers in defiance of the authorities. The rebellion was swiftly crushed by government forces, but it became a symbol of the growing push for more democratic representation. The aftermath of the rebellion saw significant reforms, including changes to the mining tax system and the introduction of more liberal voting rights. The Eureka Stockade remains a pivotal event in Australia's political history, often regarded as the birth of democracy in Australia. It highlights the growing sense of autonomy and identity among the settlers, who were increasingly viewing themselves as separate from Britain with their own interests and aspirations. Economic transformation, from wool to gold. While political changes were taking place, Australia's economy was booming. The two dominant industries of the time were wool and gold, and both had a profound impact on the land and its people. The wool industry was the backbone of the Australian economy during this period. Sheep farming expanded rapidly across the colonies, particularly in New South Wales, where vast estates, known as sheep stations, were established. The squattocracy, as they were called, were wealthy landowners who controlled large tracts of land and raised thousands of sheep. Wool became Australia's first major export, and by the 1850s, Australia was one of the world's leading suppliers of wool. The wealth generated from wool allowed many colonists to prosper, and it fueled the expansion of the colonies further inland as new grazing lands were sought out. But the economic landscape was about to shift dramatically with the discovery of gold. In 1851, gold was found in New South Wales, and shortly after, even larger deposits were discovered in Victoria. The gold rushes that followed brought people from all over the world to Australia, transforming small settlements into bustling towns almost overnight. Melbourne in particular became a boomtown, with thousands of prospectors arriving in search of fortune. The gold rushes had a profound impact on Australia's economy and society. While some struck it rich, most did not, but the influx of new settlers, particularly from Europe, China, and the Americas, contributed to Australia's growing diversity. Immigrants brought new skills, cultures, and ideas, enriching the colony's social fabric. The sudden wealth from gold also led to the construction of grand public buildings, infrastructure, and the expansion of cities, particularly in Victoria and New South Wales. The wealth generated by gold, combined with the steady income from wool, propelled Australia's colonies into a period of rapid growth and development. By the 1860s, Australia was transitioning from a collection of small, struggling settlements into prosperous, vibrant colonies with growing economies. Cultural growth and exploration of the interior. The cultural landscape of Australia was also evolving during this period. Religion, education, and the arts were becoming more established in the colonies. The Church of England was the dominant religious institution, but other denominations, such as Catholicism and Methodism, had a strong presence, particularly among Irish and Scottish settlers. Religious institutions played a significant role in shaping colonial society, particularly through their involvement in education. Churches established schools, and by the mid-19th century, there was a growing push for public education. Universities were also founded, with the University of Sydney established in 1850, followed by the University of Melbourne in 1853. In the arts, Australia began to develop its own voice. Early literary works often reflected the harsh realities of colonial life, but they also began to explore the unique landscape and experiences of the Australian colonies. Authors like Henry Savery and Henry Kingsley were among the first to write about Australia, and their works helped to shape an emerging national identity. Meanwhile, exploration of the Australian interior continued as adventurers sought to map the unknown regions of the continent. The exploration of Australia's vast inland, often referred to as the outback, was fraught with challenges. Explorers like Edward John Eyre, Ludwig Leichhardt, and John McDowell Stuart ventured into the arid interior, seeking new land for settlement and grazing. Their journeys were perilous, and many expeditions ended in tragedy. One of the most famous expeditions was led by Robert O'Hara Burke and William John Wills, who attempted to cross the continent from south to north in 1865-1860. While they succeeded in reaching the Gulf of Carpentaria, their return journey ended in disaster, with both men dying of exhaustion and starvation. Their story, like many others, captured the imagination of the public and contributed to the mythology of the Australian frontier. Exploration was not just about expansion, it was about understanding the vast and diverse landscape of Australia. These early explorers played a crucial role in mapping the continent and opening up new areas for settlement and economic development, but their efforts also highlighted the extreme difficulties posed by Australia's harsh environment. Conclusion: the foundations of a nation. The period between 1830 and 1860 was a time of profound change for Australia. The small, struggling colonies of the early 19th century had transformed into prosperous, self-governing territories with booming economies. The discovery of gold, the expansion of the wool industry, and the push for political reform all contributed to the shaping of modern Australia. These years also saw the beginnings of a uniquely Australian identity, forged through the hardships of settlement, the excitement of economic opportunity, and the exploration of a vast and untamed land. By 1860, the foundations of a future nation were firmly in place, and the next few decades would see Australia continue to grow and develop, eventually becoming the country we know today. With that said, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Australia's history, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more fascinating historical content.